German women in the occupied territories of Europe during the Second World War played a far more consequential, varied, and complex role than traditional historical narratives have long acknowledged. Their presence spanned vast geographical spaces, from the urban centers of Western Europe to the rural frontiers of the occupied East, and their contributions shaped the everyday functioning of German rule in ways both practical and ideological. While the machinery of conquest and violence was driven largely by male-dominated military and police structures, women served as nurses, teachers, clerks, social workers, propagandists, administrators, and settlers whose daily responsibilities facilitated the consolidation of German authority and the implementation of Nazi policies. Many arrived with motivations shaped by ideology, ambition, economic necessity, or a desire for adventure, having grown up within a political culture that celebrated service, racial purity, and national duty. These women entered environments marked by deep social rupture, economic exploitation, and systems of racial stratification that structured all aspects of life for the conquered populations. Their roles, though often framed as auxiliary or supportive, were embedded in the administrative and cultural systems that legitimated and maintained occupation. As caregivers, teachers, and bureaucrats, they participated in the governance of civilian populations, the distribution of scarce resources, the maintenance of order, and the reproduction of racial hierarchies that lay at the core of Nazi ideology. They processed documents that affected the fate of millions, taught children in schools designed to reshape cultural identity, staffed hospitals that reflected racial segregation, and maintained welfare services that privileged German settlers while excluding or marginalizing locals. Many women believed they were engaged in humanitarian or civilizing missions, particularly those stationed in the East, where propaganda depicted German settlement as a noble project of cultural uplift. Yet the realities they encountered, mass displacement, forced labor, violence, and profound suffering, challenged the assumptions they carried with them. Some embraced the ideological framework of the regime and saw their work as confirmation of German racial superiority. Others quietly questioned or distanced themselves from the brutality they witnessed, but continued performing tasks that supported the occupation system. Their daily interactions with local populations, marked by layers of curiosity, suspicion, authority, and emotional distance, reflected the tensions inherent in the occupation. In Western Europe, where cultural affinities were closer and racial policies less severe, women sometimes experienced smoother relations or limited forms of social contact. In Eastern Europe, however, racial ideology imposed strict boundaries that limited interactions, heightened fear, and justified the exclusion of local communities from medical care, education, and social services. German women simultaneously lived in conditions of privilege and precarity, privileged by their identity as Germans, by their access to resources, and by their role within the administrative hierarchy. Precarious in the sense that they confronted the violence of war, partisan resistance, and the harsh environments of the front. Their daily lives were infused with contradiction, moments of leisure or camaraderie juxtaposed with the suffering of local populations and the oppressive systems of which they were a part. When the tide of war turned against Germany, these contradictions sharpened. The retreat exposed the fragility of the structures that had supported German women's authority abroad. Communities they had helped build collapsed, supply lines broke down, and fear of advancing forces drove mass evacuations that forced women into the same vulnerability experienced by millions of refugees. In the aftermath of defeat, many attempted to reshape their wartime identities, emphasizing their hardships, their innocence, or their lack of agency. Post-war narratives often portrayed German women as victims of war, displacement, and occupation, overshadowing or minimizing their roles within the machinery of German rule. Only later did scholars begin to untangle these layers of memory, ideology, and gendered experience, revealing German women's participation in occupation structures as both significant and multifaceted. Studying their presence in occupied territories offers crucial insights into how authoritarian regimes operate through the work of ordinary individuals, how gender roles can be mobilized to support systems of oppression, how violence and bureaucracy intertwine, and how personal identity, ambition, belief, and survival intersect within the broader currents of history. It challenges simplistic narratives of innocence or guilt, instead presenting a more nuanced picture of agency and complicity. At its core, this topic compels us to examine how women's labor, often viewed through the lens of care, administration, or pedagogy, can simultaneously sustain systems of domination and shape the lived realities of occupation. Through their daily actions, decisions, and relationships, German women helped construct the social world of occupation, leaving a legacy that demands careful historical reflection. Their experiences reveal not only the gendered dimensions of wartime Europe, but also the complex interplay between ideology and ordinary life, between personal aspiration and political power, and between memory and history. The German occupation of Europe during the Second World War created a vast and multifaceted system of control that extended into every aspect of civilian and military life. While much of the historical narrative has focused on the male-dominated structures of the Wehrmacht, SS, and Nazi political leadership, the roles of German women within occupied territories constitute an essential dimension of the story. These women, far from being passive observers, participated, willingly or unwillingly, in the daily functioning of occupation regimes. Their experiences illuminate the intersection of gender, ideology, power, and violence in one of the most transformative and devastating periods of modern history. Gender shaped not only the types of roles women could assume, but also the expectations imposed on them by Nazi ideology. National Socialist doctrine viewed women primarily as bearers of culture, guardians of racial purity, and caretakers of family life. Yet the demands of war and occupation often pushed women into roles that contradicted these ideological prescriptions. Women became administrators, nurses, teachers, welfare workers, and occasionally collaborators in oppressive systems that enforced the racial and political objectives of the Reich. Their presence in the occupied territories reveals how gender norms were simultaneously upheld, manipulated, and violated under wartime pressures. The political and military leadership of Nazi Germany viewed the occupied territories as laboratories for social engineering, racial purification, and the expansion of German influence. Women were instrumental in shaping the cultural and social environment of these conquered regions. Their very presence, often framed as bringing order, civilization, or German values, served to legitimize the occupation. The activities of German women in these roles, whether in administrative offices or social institutions, contributed to the normalization of foreign domination and the restructuring of local societies under Nazi control. Occupation created an environment of uneven power dynamics. German women, even those of modest social standing at home, found themselves in positions of authority over local populations. This represented a striking reversal of traditional gender hierarchies, offering opportunities for empowerment that were rarely available inside Germany. Yet this empowerment was inseparable from coercion and violence. Their authority was derived from the broader machinery of occupation, which depended on surveillance, intimidation, and the suppression of resistance. The contradictions between the limits of traditional femininity and the expanded authority afforded by the Reich provoked complex questions about agency, complicity, and responsibility. The lived experiences of German women were shaped not only by ideology and policy, but also by practical necessity. The occupation needed manpower, administrative labor, medical personnel, teachers, and logistical support. Women filled these gaps, often motivated by a combination of patriotism, economic need, adventure, or coercion. Their motivations varied widely. Some sought to advance careers, some followed partners or husbands, others believed in the ideological mission of the Reich, and many simply responded to state-organized recruitment campaigns. This diversity of motivations complicates any simplistic interpretation of women as either perpetrators or victims. Understanding gender within occupation also requires examining the symbolic function women served. Propaganda portrayed them as embodiments of German orderliness, purity, and cultural superiority. Their behavior was expected to reflect the moral character of the Reich. Yet the reality in occupied territories was far more complex. Women navigated environments filled with danger, privilege, temptation, and moral ambiguity. Their letters and diaries reveal fear, loneliness, excitement, prejudice, and sometimes empathy for the local populations. These personal experiences open windows into the emotional and psychological dimensions of occupation. Another crucial element of gendered power in occupation was the regulation of sexuality. The Nazi state sought to control relationships between German women and local men with particular intensity. While relationships between German men and foreign women were often encouraged, especially in the East, where Nazi racial ideology sought to reshape demographics, relationships involving German women and local men were considered far more problematic. Fear of racial contamination, sexual vulnerability, and political reliability shaped the strict rules governing women's conduct. Nevertheless, relationships occurred, and the consequences ranged from disciplinary action to public disgrace. German women were not a monolithic group. Their backgrounds, beliefs, and behaviors varied widely. Some women embraced their roles with ideological fervor, participating actively in oppressive systems. Others performed their duties with indifference or discomfort. Still others attempted to mitigate the harshness of occupation policies, though their ability to do so was limited by the structures of power around them. Understanding their experiences requires attention to individual agency while acknowledging the overarching political and military frameworks that circumscribed their actions. The places where women served, whether Western Europe, Eastern Europe, or Scandinavia, also shaped their experiences and responsibilities. Occupation policy was not uniform across the continent. In the East, particularly in Poland and the Soviet Union, the occupation was marked by extreme violence, racial segregation, forced labor, and genocide. Women who worked there encountered the most brutal forms of Nazi policy, and their participation often intersected with coercive and lethal systems. In Western Europe, occupation relied more heavily on administrative cooperation, cultural influence, and economic extraction. This regional variation profoundly shaped women's daily interactions with local populations. Gender also played a significant role in shaping how German women remembered their wartime experiences after the fall of the Reich. Many recast themselves as apolitical, naive, or unaware of broader systems of oppression. This narrative of victimhood, often reinforced by societal expectations, obscured the extent to which women contributed to or benefited from the occupation regime. Their post-war testimonies, memoirs, and interviews must be read critically, with attention to the politics of memory. As historians continue to uncover new archival materials, letters, diaries, and administrative documents, the complexity of women's roles becomes increasingly evident. Gender analysis allows for a fuller understanding of the occupation, revealing how power operates in everyday life and how ideological systems are maintained not only through violence, but also through routine interactions. Women's participation helps explain how the occupation endured and how the Nazi project permeated daily life in the territories it controlled. Thus, examining German women in occupied territories requires a multifaceted approach that incorporates political history, gender studies, social history, and cultural analysis. It demands attention to both macro-level structures and micro-level experiences. This chapter lays the foundation for understanding the broader dynamics explored in subsequent chapters, the motivations that drew women into occupied territories, the administrative and social roles they assumed, their involvement in racial policies, their personal and emotional lives, and the ways they navigated the collapse of the Reich and its aftermath. The mobilization of German women for service in occupied territories during the Second World War was a multifaceted process shaped by ideology, state planning, economic necessity, and personal aspirations. Although Nazi ideology celebrated traditional gender norms that emphasized motherhood, domesticity, and racial purity, the realities of wartime expansion required the regime to recruit women in large numbers for administrative, medical, social, and logistical work. Understanding why women participated in these roles requires examining both the structural forces behind their mobilization and the individual motivations that propelled them into newly conquered regions. Women's involvement in occupation regimes did not emerge spontaneously. It resulted from deliberate recruitment by Nazi institutions such as the NS Frauenschaft, the National Socialist Women's League, the Deutsches Frauenwerk, the Bund Deutscher Mädel, BDM, and labor organizations linked to the Red Cross, welfare departments, and the civil service. The state presented these roles as patriotic contributions to the war effort, emphasizing women's duty to support soldiers, uplift German cultural values, and stabilize newly acquired territories. This framing drew heavily on pre-existing gender norms, but it also subtly expanded the idea of women's public service by associating it with national destiny and racial mission. The outbreak of war in 1939 created vast administrative demands. As German forces advanced across Europe, occupying Poland, France, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and later much of Eastern Europe, they left behind governments, police systems, and civil administrations that required staffing. Millions of men were drafted or deployed to the front, creating labor shortages in offices, schools, welfare departments, hospitals, and supply networks. Women stepped into these roles not merely because the state called upon them, but because wartime conditions opened professional opportunities previously unavailable to them. For some, service in the occupied territories represented a rare chance at independence, financial stability, or career advancement. Ideology played a significant role in motivating women to volunteer or accept postings abroad. National Socialist propaganda idealized the East as a space where Germans would build a new racial order, portraying it as both a place of danger and a frontier of opportunity. For some women, particularly younger ones influenced by BDM training, the idea of helping to civilize or re-Germanize the East aligned with their internalized beliefs about racial hierarchy and cultural destiny. Posters, textbooks, and speeches emphasized women's duty to maintain moral order, support soldiers, and strengthen German rule by exemplifying discipline and racial purity. Economic motivations were equally significant. Many working-class and lower-middle-class women faced limited job prospects in Germany, especially during wartime. Service in the occupied territories often offered higher salaries, free housing, ration privileges, and social status. Secretaries, clerks, nurses, and teachers found that postings abroad could improve their financial situation and living standards. In some cases, women were directly incentivized through bonus pay or career guarantees upon return. The allure of better conditions should not be underestimated, particularly during a period when shortages and hardships were becoming increasingly common in the Reich. Social motivations also influenced women's decisions. Some were eager for adventure, escape from family environments, or a chance to see the world beyond their hometowns. Diaries and letters reveal that many women experienced curiosity, excitement, and a sense of liberation as they traveled eastward or westward into newly conquered territories. Wartime propaganda often romanticized these journeys, portraying women as bearers of German culture who would bring cleanliness, order, and modernity to backward regions. This narrative provided emotional and psychological validation for their participation. Another important factor was personal connection. Women sometimes followed fiancés, husbands, or relatives who were stationed in occupied regions. Marriage policies and permissions were complicated by military service, and many couples saw assignments in occupied territories as opportunities to remain near one another. The German military and SS also encouraged family visits or relocations in some regions, particularly where settler colonies were established. In these cases, women's presence was part of a broader attempt to create stable German communities abroad. Not all women volunteered, some were conscripted or pressured into service. As the war dragged on, labor shortages intensified, and the state increasingly relied on compulsory assignments. Women in certain sectors, especially medical and administrative fields, could be ordered to serve in occupied areas. For these women, motivations were shaped less by ideology or opportunity, but more by obligation, fear of punishment, or lack of alternatives. Nevertheless, even those who were coerced into service found themselves woven into the fabric of occupation, often performing tasks that facilitated the functioning of authoritarian control. Mobilization efforts also relied heavily on education and training programs designed to prepare women for the conditions they would face. Courses on racial theory, hygiene, nursing, childcare, and administrative procedure were often mandatory. These programs served a dual purpose. They provided practical skills and attempted to instill ideological discipline. Teachers assigned to Poland or the Soviet territories, for example, received instruction not only in curriculum planning, but also in how to identify and suppress the cultural influences of local populations. Nurses learned protocols for treating German soldiers while enforcing racial segregation in hospitals and clinics. Wartime mobilization intersected with generational differences. Younger women, particularly raised under Nazi rule, were more likely to embrace ideological motivations. The BDM had inculcated values of sacrifice, discipline, physical fitness, and loyalty to the Führer. Many young women saw service in occupied territories as an extension of their youth training, a chance to embody national ideals. Older women, by contrast, often approached mobilization through practical or familial lenses, though some likewise embraced ideological justifications. Geography also influenced mobilization patterns. Women assigned to Western Europe typically encountered environments with established infrastructure and relatively stable living conditions. Their motivations reflected expectations of respectable work and manageable risks. Those sent to Eastern Europe faced harsher climates, ideological scrutiny, and the constant threat of partisan activity. The state portrayed Eastern postings as requiring individuals of exceptional commitment. Women who accepted such roles were often driven by a combination of ideological fervor, economic incentives, and a desire for purpose. Mobilization campaigns portrayed service in the East as heroic and culturally transformative. Posters and pamphlets depicted smiling women working at desks, tending to children, or assisting soldiers, framed by images of vast fields or shining new settlements. The underlying message was clear. By serving abroad, women were helping to shape the future of the Reich. These narratives glossed over the realities of occupation, such as brutality, forced labor, and the suppression of local culture. Yet they were effective in shaping perceptions and motivating thousands to accept assignments. Women's mobilization cannot be separated from the larger goals of the Nazi state. Their roles in occupied territories were essential to the functioning of administration, welfare, healthcare, education, and settlement. Without women, the occupation regimes would have lacked crucial personnel and support services. Thus, mobilizing women served both strategic and ideological functions. It filled labor shortages and reinforced visions of a new racial and social order. The diversity of motivations, ideological, economic, emotional, social, and coerced, reflects the complexity of women's experiences. It underscores the importance of viewing them neither solely as perpetrators nor as victims. Their participation arose from a mixture of personal agency and structural forces. Understanding this complexity allows for a more nuanced analysis of how ordinary individuals become implicated in systems of power. Ultimately, the mobilization of German women for service in occupied territories reveals how deeply gender intersected with policies of expansion and occupation. Women were not merely filling gaps left by male soldiers, they were integral to the administration, cultural projection, and stabilization of the Reich's vast empire. Their motivations illuminate the psychological and social mechanisms through which authoritarian regimes recruit support, cultivate loyalty, and harness the labor and aspirations of their citizens. The administrative and bureaucratic rules occupied by German women in the territories conquered by the Third Reich formed a crucial backbone of occupation governance. While often overshadowed by the more visible presence of soldiers, SS personnel, and local collaborationist authorities, the presence of German women in offices, communication centers, supply departments, and military administration had a profound impact on daily life under occupation. Their work provided the essential logistical, clerical, and organizational support that allowed the Nazi regime to project power across vast regions. In many cases, these women became the primary face of occupation authority encountered by local civilians. German women entered administrative positions through a variety of channels. As men were drafted into military service, massive shortages emerged in civil service posts and support roles within the Wehrmacht. The German state, recognizing the necessity of sustaining control over newly annexed or occupied regions, initiated broad recruitment drives. These targeted trained stenographers, typists, secretaries, bookkeepers, clerks, telephone operators, and other office staff. The state framed these roles as patriotic contributions that supported the war effort while maintaining order in newly conquered territories. Women's professional labor, once restricted to domestic or civilian spheres, became instrumental to the functioning of an authoritarian empire. The presence of women in occupation offices represented a significant shift in traditional gender norms. Prior to the war, German bureaucratic institutions were typically male-dominated, with women occupying limited clerical positions. Under wartime conditions, however, women rapidly advanced into roles that gave them greater responsibility and authority. They managed correspondence, drafted official documents, oversaw personnel files, and enforced regulations. Some served in financial offices, authorizing payments, tracking resources, and distributing wages. Others worked in logistical departments, coordinating transport, supply chains, and procurement for military and civil operations. Their organizational labor was essential to sustaining the administrative order that defined occupation life. Secretaries were among the most common female workers in occupied territories. Yet their duties extended far beyond taking dictation or managing schedules. Secretaries often controlled access to male superiors, filtered information, and interacted daily with local populations seeking permits, permissions, or documentation. In many cases, secretaries became the practical administrators of policy, translating directives into routinized procedures. They processed applications for work permits, travel passes, food rations, housing assignments, and countless other aspects of civilian life. Their decisions, though often bounded by rules, could influence the lives of civilians in profound ways. Clerical workers also provided essential support to the German military administration. In military command posts, women typed reports, maintained unit records, produced maps, and coordinated communication between field units and central command. They handled sensitive information, including details about military movements, anti-partisan operations, and the surveillance of local populations. In some regions, especially in Eastern Europe, clerks and secretaries were embedded within the machinery of occupation that produced forced labor quotas, deportation lists, and population censuses. Their administrative labor facilitated the bureaucratic processes underlying exploitation and repression. Telephone and telegraph operators, many of them women, maintained the communication networks that connected occupation authorities across long distances. They transmitted orders, monitored conversations, and recorded messages. In occupied territories where resistance movements were active, the reliability of communication systems was crucial to German efforts to maintain control. The women who operated switchboards were often privy to confidential information, making their roles both strategically significant and politically sensitive. Their work demanded discipline, discretion, and unwavering adherence to protocol. Women also worked in propaganda departments, assisting with the distribution of newspapers, posters, radio announcements, and cultural materials designed to promote German authority. Administrative staff helped coordinate cultural events, exhibitions, and lectures aimed at Germanizing local populations or asserting ideological dominance. Through these activities, women contributed to the soft power dimensions of occupation, reinforcing narratives of order, superiority, and inevitability. In regions where Germany sought to implement racial restructuring, most notably in Eastern Europe, female administrators played key roles in population management. They processed identification documents, registered civilians, and classified individuals according to racial categories established by the Nazi state. Women worked in settlement offices, archives, and demographic bureaus that sought to reorder populations based on racial ideology. These tasks were not merely clerical, they were components of a broader system of control that facilitated segregation, deportation, and exploitation. In some occupied territories, German women held positions within local municipal or regional government structures. They became intermediaries between German authorities and local officials, overseeing the distribution of resources, implementing educational directives, and ensuring compliance with occupation regulations. This required negotiation, communication skills, and a level of authority unusual for women in pre-war Germany. Their interactions with local populations could range from authoritarian to cooperative, depending on personality, circumstance, and regional conditions. Administrative roles also placed women in morally ambiguous situations. Many were aware of the injustices and violence occurring around them, but the bureaucratic nature of their work created distance between their tasks and the consequences of the policies they supported. Their actions were often framed as routine, procedural, or necessary for order. Yet these seemingly mundane activities, typing lists, stamping documents, filing reports, were essential components of the machinery of occupation. This raises important questions about complicity and responsibility, particularly within systems that rely on countless small acts of obedience. The day-to-day realities of administrative work varied depending on location. In Western Europe, many offices were located in established buildings, and working conditions were relatively comfortable. Women enjoyed access to cafes, cinemas, and social events organized for German personnel. In Eastern Europe, conditions were often harsher. Offices sometimes operated in makeshift buildings, former estates, or requisitioned homes. Women faced shortages, harsh climates, partisan attacks, and pervasive insecurity. These challenges shaped their attitudes toward work, local populations, and the occupation project itself. Interactions between German women and local civilians were influenced by power imbalances embedded in occupation structures. Civilians seeking documents or assistance often encountered German women as the first point of contact. Some women exercised their authority harshly, enforcing rules rigidly or expressing open disdain for local populations. Others behaved sympathetically, bending rules when possible or seeking to ease burdens. These interactions provide insight into how occupation policies were experienced on a personal level. They also illustrate how gender shaped power relations. Women often wielded authority through bureaucratic control, rather than physical force. Administrative roles also affected women's social status within occupation communities. Clerical workers, secretaries, and office supervisors could become influential figures within German social circles abroad. They were often included in leisure activities, social events, and community gatherings. Their proximity to high-ranking officials sometimes afforded them privileges, including better housing, access to supplies, and enhanced social capital. At the same time, some women faced hostility from male colleagues who believed women were intruding into male domains or receiving undue favoritism. Propaganda frequently portrayed female administrators as symbols of order, discipline, and cultural superiority. Images of well-dressed secretaries, efficient clerks, and diligent office workers reinforced the image of a modern, competent, and civilized German presence. These portrayals concealed the reality that many administrative activities supported systems of exploitation. Nevertheless, women sometimes internalized these representations, seeing themselves as agents of progress or guardians of civilization. For some women, administrative service was a career-defining experience. They acquired skills, gained independence, and occupied positions of responsibility that would have been unlikely at home. After the war, many drew on these experiences to pursue careers in civilian administration. However, the post-war context often forced women to downplay or reinterpret their roles in occupied territories. Some described their work as purely clerical, minimizing their involvement in broader systems of control. Others framed themselves as victims of circumstance, claiming they had little choice in their assignments. German women serving in social, medical, and welfare roles in occupied territories played a pivotal part in shaping the daily realities of occupation. Their presence extended beyond the administrative offices and into hospitals, welfare centers, children's homes, and community programs designed to stabilize, influence, or control the populations living under German rule. These women worked at the intersection of care and coercion, performing duties that combined humanitarian functions with ideological enforcement. Understanding their contributions requires a detailed examination of their institutions, responsibilities, and interactions with both German personnel and local civilians. The German Red Cross, Deutsches Rotes Kreuz, DRK, was one of the most significant organizations mobilizing women for medical service. Thousands of women trained as nurses, aides, and orderlies served in hospitals across occupied Europe. Their duties included treating wounded soldiers, managing hospital wards, providing bedside care, and maintaining medical records. But the realities of occupation meant they also confronted extreme conditions, including shortages of supplies, epidemics, and constant pressure from military authorities. In some cases, nurses worked in facilities where forced laborers or prisoners received inadequate treatment or were segregated according to racial categories. Although not all nurses directly participated in abuse, their presence in these systems inevitably tied them to the broader structures of oppression. In addition to hospitals, German women staffed field clinics, mobile medical units, and aid stations located near military operations. These facilities often moved with advancing forces, requiring women to adapt quickly to dangerous and unstable environments. Nurses who served near the Eastern Front faced especially harsh conditions, freezing temperatures, poor sanitation, and relentless waves of casualties. Their letters reveal exhaustion, fear, and trauma, but also dedication to their roles and pride in their contributions. The emotional burden of tending to wounded soldiers shaped their identities and reinforced their sense of duty to the nation. Medical workers also served in maternity wards, children's hospitals, and racial hygiene clinics. These roles were profoundly influenced by Nazi ideological priorities. In regions targeted for Germanization, such as parts of Poland and Czechoslovakia, welfare organizations established children's homes designed to re-educate children deemed racially suitable for assimilation into German society. Women working in these institutions provided care, education, and supervision, often believing they were offering children better futures. Yet these programs frequently involved the forced removal of children from their families and the erasure of their cultural identities. Thus, the caregiving roles performed by German women were intertwined with coercive demographic engineering. Teachers played another central role in the social transformation envisioned by occupation authorities. German women assigned to schools in occupied territories taught not only basic subjects, but also German language, culture, and ideology. They were often instructed to suppress local languages and traditions, promote loyalty to the Reich, and encourage students to conform to German cultural norms. In some regions, schools for local children were closed or restricted, while schools for German settlers were expanded. Female teachers therefore became agents of cultural hegemony, using education as a vehicle for asserting German authority. Social workers also contributed significantly to the occupation infrastructure. They distributed food, clothing, and fuel to German families living abroad, ensuring the stability of settler communities. They organized child care programs, cultural events, and community activities designed to maintain morale. Social workers sometimes extended services to local populations, particularly in Western Europe, where occupation authorities sought to maintain a facade of benevolence. These activities helped soften the image of occupation while subtly reinforcing German control. In Eastern Europe, however, welfare programs focused almost exclusively on German settlers and personnel, reflecting the racial hierarchy at the core of Nazi policy. Women's welfare organizations, including the National Socialist People's Welfare (NSV), operated extensively in occupied territories. NSV workers evaluated families, processed applications for benefits, and monitored the behavior of German settlers to ensure ideological conformity. They conducted home visits, assessed cleanliness and discipline, and provided guidance on child-rearing practices aligned with Nazi ideals. Their oversight function allowed them to exercise considerable influence within settler communities, effectively policing private life. The overlap between caregiving and ideological work was a defining feature of female service in welfare roles. Women were expected to embody virtues such as compassion, discipline, and racial purity. Their caregiving labor was framed as essential to maintaining the moral and physical health of the German nation. Yet this identity was inseparable from the structures of domination that defined occupation. Women who provided social or medical services to German communities often benefited from privilege and power, while local populations, especially Jews, Slavs, forced laborers, and partisans, were excluded or actively harmed by these same systems. The interactions between German women and local civilians varied by region. In Western Europe, nurses and social workers sometimes treated or assisted locals, particularly in areas where collaborationist regimes sought to maintain stability. German women in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands often found themselves navigating complex relationships with civilians who resented occupation but relied on certain services. The tone of these interactions ranged from professional or cordial to distant and suspicious. In Eastern Europe, interactions were shaped by harsher racial policies. German medical staff frequently segregated patients, prioritized soldiers, and denied adequate care to local populations. Welfare programs rarely extended beyond German communities, and teachers enforced strict cultural hierarchies. Women operating in these systems were expected to maintain clear boundaries between Germans and non-Germans. Some embraced these distinctions with ideological zeal, while others expressed discomfort or confusion in personal writings. Nevertheless, their work reinforced a racialized division of care. Women in medical and social roles also confronted personal dangers. Hospitals and welfare centers were sometimes targeted by partisans or caught in the crossfire of military operations. Nurses and aid workers were exposed to disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion. Their work demanded emotional resilience as they witnessed traumatic injuries, death, and the psychological toll on soldiers and civilians alike. Despite these hardships, many women viewed their roles as meaningful and honorable, contributing to their persistence and loyalty. The daily routines of medical and welfare workers were shaped by discipline and regulation. Nurses adhered to strict schedules, maintained cleanliness standards, recorded detailed patient information, and followed protocols governing medication, diet, and treatment. Teachers followed standardized curricula and were subject to state inspections. Social workers filed reports, completed evaluations, and coordinated with higher authorities. These bureaucratic structures tied women's labor to the broader administrative system of occupation, reinforcing the mechanisms by which German control was imposed. Propaganda played a central role in shaping and sustaining women's involvement in medical and welfare service. Images of caring nurses, devoted teachers, and cheerful social workers circulated widely in posters, magazines, and newsreels. These portrayals emphasized women's nurturing qualities while framing their work as vital to the war effort. They obscured the realities of coercion, inequality, and suffering experienced by local populations. Women themselves sometimes internalized these narratives, viewing their positions as expressions of patriotism and moral duty. The experiences of women in social, medical, and welfare roles varied widely depending on their personal backgrounds and the environments in which they served. Some approached their duties with genuine compassion for patients and children. Others exercised authority harshly or demonstrated indifference toward the suffering of non-German populations. Still others found themselves morally conflicted, struggling to reconcile their caregiving identities with the oppressive systems of which they were a part. These diverse experiences highlight the complexities of agency and complicity within authoritarian structures. German women played complex and often deeply troubling roles in the racial policies that structured life in the occupied territories during the Second World War. Although the machinery of racial persecution and genocide was primarily driven by male-dominated organizations such as the SS, Wehrmacht leadership, and civil administrators, women served as indispensable participants in enforcing, sustaining, and legitimizing these systems. Their roles ranged widely. Some were active believers in racial ideology, some were passive functionaries, and others found themselves drawn into systems of segregation and discrimination through the everyday routines of their work. Yet even in seemingly minor responsibilities, their participation contributed to the broader racial project that lay at the heart of Nazi occupation policy. To understand women's roles in racial policies, one must first recognize the ideological framework that shaped their training and assignments. National Socialist ideology conceptualized race as the foundation of social order. Women were instructed from adolescence through organizations like the Bund Deutsche Mädel (BDM) to view racial purity, biological health, and cultural cohesion as essential to the nation's future. These messages influenced many aspects of their behavior in occupied territories. Teachers, nurses, social workers, and clerks were all expected to model racial discipline, to maintain strict boundaries between Germans and non-Germans, and to act as moral guardians of German communities abroad. In the East, especially in Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, the implementation of racial policies was far more brutal and direct than in Western Europe. German women working in the East encountered environments defined by racial segregation, ghettoization, forced labor, and mass violence. Even when not personally involved in atrocities, they operated within a system in which non-German populations were systematically dehumanized. Their roles in offices, schools, and welfare organizations were inseparable from the broader genocidal context. One of the most direct ways women contributed to racial policy was through the management of population records. Administrators processed identity cards, residency documents, work permits, and racial classifications. In many regions, these documents determined who could work, travel, or live in particular areas, and who would be deported or placed in forced labor. Female clerks typed lists that categorized Jews, Poles, Slavs, Roma, and other minority groups according to discriminatory regulations. These documents could mean life or death, and although women often viewed their tasks as routine clerical duties, they formed the bureaucratic infrastructure of racial persecution. Women working in racial offices or administrative branches of the SS, such as the Hauptamt, Volksdeutsche Mittelstelle, responsible for managing ethnic German resettlement, were directly exposed to racial ideology. Some became active enforcers of policy, rejecting applications for status upgrades, flagging families for racial examination, or helping implement segregation orders. Others approached these tasks mechanically, focusing on paperwork while ignoring the implications. Regardless of intention, their participation enabled the expansion and enforcement of racial categories across occupied Europe. Medical workers also played a central role in racial policy. Nurses were trained to prioritize German soldiers and settlers while providing minimal or segregated treatment to local populations. In many hospitals, separate wards existed for Jews, Poles, POWs, and Germans with drastically unequal conditions. Some nurses internalized racial hierarchies and denied comfort or adequate care to those deemed racially inferior. Others expressed discomfort in private writings, though they continued following regulations. More disturbing were the roles of women in racial hygiene clinics and child welfare programs. In regions targeted for Germanization, racial experts examined local populations, particularly children, to determine whether they possessed Germanic characteristics. Female nurses, welfare workers, and educators were involved in these assessments. Children deemed racially valuable were forcibly removed from their families, given German names, and placed in institutions or adoptive homes. Women working in these facilities provided care, education, and supervision, often believing they were rescuing children from poverty or inferior environments. Their participation helped erase cultural identities and contributed to the kidnapping and assimilation of thousands of children. Teachers also enforced racial policies by shaping the ideological environment of schools. In territories where German schools were established for settlers, female teachers promoted a curriculum emphasizing German racial superiority, cultural purity, and loyalty to the Reich. In schools that remained open to local populations, primarily in Western Europe, teachers enforced segregation through academic tracking, disciplinary practices, and restricted access to resources. In Eastern Europe, many schools for local children were closed entirely, and teachers contributed to the cultural suppression of Slavic languages and traditions. Settlement programs further illustrate the roles women played in racial restructuring. As Germany sought to create German colonies in Eastern Europe, welfare workers and administrators assisted in the selection and placement of ethnic German families. Women assessed household behavior, cleanliness, ideological reliability, and racial suitability. They made recommendations about which families should receive homes, farms, or benefits. Through these evaluations, women helped determine which populations were deemed fit for inclusion in the new racial order and which were to be displaced. In many rural settlement areas, German women worked as the social and cultural anchors of new communities. They established schools, clinics, welfare offices, and cultural clubs intended to solidify German dominance. Their presence signaled permanence and legitimacy, reinforcing the idea that German settlers were bringing civilization to the East. Some settlers openly embraced this mission, viewing themselves as pioneers of a racial frontier. Others simply adapted to new surroundings without reflecting deeply on the displacement or suffering of local populations. The daily routines of women in occupied territories frequently brought them into contact with racial policies, even if indirectly. Women managing food ration cards, for example, enforced differential rationing schemes that privileged Germans over locals. Secretaries who distributed travel passes or work assignments upheld systems designed to restrict the movement of Jews, Poles, and other groups. Welfare workers who provided assistance to German families often reported local individuals who appeared suspicious or ideologically unreliable. In each case, women acted as nodes within a vast system of surveillance, segregation, and control. It is important, however, to acknowledge that not all women embraced racial policies with enthusiasm. Personal letters and diaries indicate a range of reactions. Some expressed disgust at the violence they witnessed or sympathy for local civilians. Some resisted implementing discriminatory rules, either through small acts of empathy or by ignoring strict regulations. Others complied reluctantly, fearing punishment or job loss. Yet even reluctant compliance contributed to the functioning of the system. Nevertheless, a significant number of women demonstrated active support for racial ideology. Many had been deeply influenced by Nazi propaganda and saw themselves as protectors of the German race. Nurses sometimes referred to non-Germans as unworthy or primitive. Teachers emphasized the danger of racial mixing. Clerks took pride in implementing regulations they believed preserved racial purity. These attitudes were especially prevalent among younger women who had been immersed in ideological education before the war. The complexity of women's roles becomes even more evident when considering their proximity to violence. Although German women rarely participated directly in executions or mass shootings, some witnessed atrocities or worked near sites of mass murder. A few served in concentration camps or forced labor camps in roles ranging from clerks to guards, though these cases were limited compared to male perpetrators. More commonly, women in nearby administrative or medical roles facilitated the logistical mechanisms that enabled forced labor, deportation, and extermination. Gender shaped the nature of women's involvement in racial policy. Women were often assigned tasks framed as caring, organizing, or teaching. Yet these tasks supported racial segregation and population control. Their authority operated through paperwork, discipline, and cultural influence rather than physical force. This enabled women to participate in racism through professional expertise and bureaucratic routine, reinforcing the idea that racial policy was not only a violent enterprise, but also an administrative and cultural one. The experience of German women in occupied territories was not defined solely by their work or ideological roles. It was also shaped by the relationships they formed, the social environments they navigated, and the daily routines that governed their lives. As female administrators, nurses, teachers, settlers, and welfare workers spread across occupied Europe, they entered unfamiliar landscapes marked by political tension, cultural division, and the practical demands of wartime life. Their interactions with German men, local civilians, and fellow women shaped communities that were at once hierarchical, regimented, and socially constrained. Chapter 6 explores these intimate and social dimensions, revealing how personal life intersected with power, ideology, and violence. Life for German women in the occupied territories often began with a mixture of excitement, apprehension, and ideological enthusiasm. Many women, especially younger ones, traveled beyond Germany for the first time when assigned to newly occupied regions. They recorded in diaries the awe they felt at crossing borders, seeing vast eastern landscapes, or moving through newly conquered cities. Some described a sense of adventure, anticipating meaningful work or a chance to serve the Reich abroad. Others expressed unease, facing cultural unfamiliarity, language barriers, and the visible signs of conflict, from ruins to refugees and military patrols. These early impressions often shaped their subsequent adaptation to occupied life. Relationships with German soldiers and male administrators were central to the daily experiences of many women. In numerous postings, women lived in close proximity to military units, sharing workplaces, barracks, dining facilities, or leisure spaces. These interactions frequently developed into friendships, mentorships, or romantic relationships. Soldiers often welcomed the presence of German women, who provided a sense of familiarity and moral support amid the hardships of occupation. Women, in turn, found companionship and security among soldiers who were both protectors and potential partners. Romantic relationships between German women and soldiers were widespread, though sometimes officially discouraged. Military authorities worried that relationships might distract men from their duties or lead to pregnancies that complicated assignments. Nonetheless, many women formed deep attachments, documented through letters exchanged across front lines or during temporary separations. Some women became engaged or married while stationed abroad. Others entered short-lived romances shaped by the instability and urgency of wartime life. These relationships offered moments of emotional intimacy within a broader context of violence and uncertainty. Female friendships also played a critical role in fostering community and emotional resilience. Women working in hospitals, schools, or administrative offices often lived together, sharing rooms or small apartments. These arrangements cultivated strong bonds, as women cooked together, exchanged confidences, and supported one another through illness, homesickness, or workplace tensions. In letters, women emphasized the importance of companionship in sustaining morale and creating a sense of normalcy. Gossip, storytelling, holiday celebrations, and birthday gatherings enriched their social lives and provided a contrast to the harsh environments surrounding them. Social life for German women was influenced heavily by the policies and restrictions imposed by occupation authorities. In many territories, interactions between Germans and local civilians were strictly regulated. Women were encouraged or ordered to avoid fraternization, especially in the East, where locals were considered racially inferior according to Nazi ideology. Dining halls, theaters, recreation centers, and social clubs were often segregated, limiting women's contact with the local population. In Western Europe, such as France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, restrictions were sometimes less rigid, though social boundaries still existed. German women navigated these regulations carefully, balancing personal curiosity or compassion with fear of reprimand or ideological expectations. Despite restrictions, interactions between German women and local civilians were inevitable. Teachers, nurses, and welfare workers encountered locals in their daily duties. Some interactions were professional or distant, others became more personal. Women sometimes formed bonds with local children in their classrooms or clinics, offering kindness within a system designed to control or Germanize them. In Western Europe, cordial exchanges with neighbors or shopkeepers occurred occasionally, though always under surveillance. In Eastern Europe, fear, resentment, and racial hostility shaped encounters. German women often described locals as unfriendly or threatening, reflecting both ideological indoctrination and genuine tensions caused by occupation policies. For many women, domestic life formed a central part of their daily routine. Living conditions varied dramatically depending on location, status, and available resources. Some women lived in comfortable houses once owned by displaced local families. Others occupied cramped rooms in overcrowded buildings. In frontier settlements, women often struggled with limited heating, insufficient food, or primitive sanitation. They performed household chores, such as cooking, washing clothes, and maintaining living quarters, even while working full-time. Scarcity of goods forced women to improvise, barter, or rely on supply shipments from Germany. These challenges shaped their perceptions of the territories and influenced their sense of isolation or hardship. Food played a complicated role in the daily realities of German women. While Germans generally received better rations than local populations, shortages were common, especially in the East. Women working in administrative offices or hospitals sometimes had access to extra food through workplace kitchens. Others struggled to obtain basic supplies and wrote home requesting parcels. Meals served as important social occasions, with women gathering in mess halls or private spaces to share food, discuss the day's events, and find brief comfort in routine. The disparity between German meals and the starvation experienced by many locals reinforced both privilege and guilt. Leisure activities for German women varied significantly depending on their postings. In major cities, women visited cinemas, restaurants, cafes, or cultural events organized by German authorities. They attended concerts, lectures, or propaganda evenings designed to strengthen ideological commitment. In smaller towns or rural settlements, leisure was more modest, reading, knitting, writing letters, or joining group walks. Holidays like Christmas or Easter were celebrated with special programs, decorations, and gatherings offering a sense of continuity with life in Germany. For many women, these moments of respite provided emotional anchors in an environment otherwise marked by tension and instability. Yet the same social spaces that fostered community also reflected the inequalities and injustices of occupation. Cinemas, clubs, and restaurants were often closed to locals or heavily restricted, emphasizing the privileged position of Germans. Women working in these spaces became enforcers, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes willingly, of segregation. Their presence in theaters and social clubs reinforced the cultural dominance that occupation authorities sought to establish. Even leisure became politicized, with women's participation reaffirming the hierarchical social order imposed by the Reich. Relationships with local men, including romantic or sexual relationships, were extremely rare and heavily stigmatized. German women who engaged in such relationships faced severe punishment, including reassignment, imprisonment, or accusations of racial defilement. Fear of surveillance discouraged even casual conversations with local men in the East, where interracial interaction was treated as a racial threat. In the West, although policies were less extreme, women still risked social disapproval or disciplinary action. As a result, German women remained largely isolated from local male communities, reinforcing divisions. The presence of violence shaped the psychological and emotional lives of German women. Partisan attacks, bombings, and military reprisals were common in many territories. Women who worked near front lines or in volatile regions lived with constant uncertainty. They described nights spent in air raid shelters, sudden evacuations, or encounters with wounded soldiers. The proximity to violence also influenced their relationships, intensifying bonds with friends or lovers and heightening the fragility of daily life. Some women developed resilience and stoicism. Others suffered from anxiety, nightmares, or emotional exhaustion. The final phase of the war brought profound upheaval for German women serving in occupied territories. What had once seemed like stable postings, adventurous assignments, or opportunities for professional development quickly dissolved into chaos as the military situation deteriorated. By late 1943 and 1944, the German retreat across Europe forced women into increasingly desperate circumstances. Hospitals emptied in haste, administrative offices burned documents to prevent their capture, and entire settlements fled before advancing Allied or Soviet forces. The collapse of the Reich created a dramatic shift in the daily realities, psychological states, and moral narratives of German women, pushing them into experiences shaped by fear, uncertainty, and reckoning. Signs of instability emerged slowly at first. Women stationed in the East reported rising partisan activity, shortages of food and medicine, and the growing presence of wounded or traumatized soldiers. Administrative workers noticed sudden changes in policies, rapid relocations of offices, and contradictory orders from superiors. Teachers described dwindling school attendance as families fled or hid from violence. Nurses faced overcrowded hospitals filled with casualties from renewed Soviet offensives. The everyday structures that had governed occupation life began to fray, leaving women anxious and uncertain about their futures. As the front lines moved closer, fear became an omnipresent part of life. Women in hospitals and administrative centers were often among the first to hear unsettling rumors, stories of German defeats, partisan victories, or atrocities committed by retreating troops. Many women wrote in their diaries about sleepless nights, rapidly packed suitcases, and the eerie silence that preceded evacuations. Fear of Soviet forces was especially intense, fueled by propaganda that emphasized the threat of sexual violence and revenge. This fear shaped evacuation decisions and left a lasting emotional imprint on those who fled. Evacuations were chaotic and often terrifying. Women fled in trucks, trains, horse-drawn wagons, or on foot, carrying only what they could manage. Nurses sometimes evacuated hospitals while still caring for patients, struggling to move wounded soldiers through snow or along bombed roads. Administrative workers loaded typewriters and documents into vehicles until the last possible moment. Teachers attempted to keep children together in improvised groups. Many women experienced hunger, exhaustion, exposure, and constant danger as they attempted to stay ahead of advancing armies. For some, evacuation came too late. Women were caught in the midst of battles, exposed to bombings, or trapped in encircled areas. Some were captured by Soviet forces, experiencing harsh conditions, interrogations, or sexual violence. Others attempted to hide among retreating refugees, blending into vast columns of civilians whose suffering characterized the end of the war. Letters and testimonies from survivors reveal the trauma of this period, trauma marked by loss of control, physical danger, and the collapse of the systems that had once supported them. The retreat also exposed the fragility of the ideological frameworks that had once guided women's work abroad. Many women confronted contradictions between their earlier beliefs and the brutal realities unfolding around them. Nurses who had once embraced their roles enthusiastically now struggled to reconcile the propaganda of racial superiority with the desperate plight of wounded German soldiers. Teachers who had promoted Nazi ideology were forced to abandon their students. Welfare workers who had enforced racial categories now faced their own precarious existence as refugees. These contradictions contributed to a growing sense of disillusionment among some women, while others clung more firmly to ideological explanations for Germany's defeat. Relationships that had once provided stability were strained by the pressures of retreat. Lovers were separated, friendships disrupted, and marriages strained by distance or uncertainty. Women who had relied on soldiers for protection suddenly found themselves alone or surrounded by strangers. Some soldiers attempted to remain with the women they cared about, while others prioritized military orders. The emotional toll of separation, abandonment, or loss left lasting marks on many women, shaping their memories of the war. Social structures also collapsed. The recreational activities, gatherings, and communities that had supported women in earlier years disappeared. Rationing became erratic, food scarce, and travel dangerous. Many women resorted to improvisation, bartering, scavenging, or relying on sympathetic civilians. Their privileged status evaporated as they joined the masses of refugees crowding roads and temporary shelters. The contrast between their earlier lives in occupation and the hardships of retreat was stark and devastating. As German authority crumbled, women confronted the consequences of their roles in the occupation. Documents were burned, uniforms discarded, and ideological symbols hidden or destroyed. Some women feared retribution from local populations who had suffered under German rule. In the East especially, local civilians sometimes attacked German retreating personnel, including women. This atmosphere of retribution intensified the panic and desperation of the retreat. After the collapse of Germany, many women entered captivity or displaced persons camps where they faced interrogation by Allied authorities. Denazification processes forced women to account for their wartime service. Most portrayed themselves as innocent, apolitical, or unaware of the broader racial and violent policies of the regime. Nurses emphasized their humanitarian duties. Clerks insisted they had only followed orders. Teachers described themselves as powerless. These narratives shaped post-war memory and contributed to a widespread perception that German women had played passive or marginal roles in the occupation. Yet, archival evidence reveals a more complex truth. While many women did not commit acts of violence, they participated in systems that supported racial segregation, forced labor, and cultural suppression. The disjunction between their post-war testimonies and their wartime roles reflects a broader pattern of selective memory, influenced by trauma, shame, and the need to reintegrate into post-war society. Women often reframed their experiences as stories of suffering, emphasizing their hardships during retreat while minimizing their earlier participation in the occupation apparatus. The process of reintegration varied widely. Some women returned to their hometowns, attempting to rebuild normal lives. Others faced suspicion, poverty, or loss of family members. Former teachers or nurses sometimes resumed their professions, though denazification tribunals occasionally barred them from public service. Social workers and administrators confronted greater stigma, as their roles were more clearly linked to racial policy. Many women married or emigrated, seeking distance from the past. Memory of wartime service evolved over the decades. In the immediate post-war years, German society tended to portray women as victims of bombings, hunger, and Soviet occupation. This narrative overshadowed discussions of women's participation in occupied territories. Only in later decades did scholars and the public begin to examine the nuanced and sometimes troubling aspects of women's roles. Personal memoirs, interviews, and archival research revealed a complex picture. Women who were both caregivers and enforcers, both victims and participants, both constrained by patriarchy and empowered by their roles in the occupation system. Today, the study of German women in occupied territories highlights the intersection of gender, power, and ideology. The collapse of the German occupation revealed the fragility of the social and political structures that had once sustained women's authority abroad.